During the time when God sent judges to help Israel, there was a woman named Hannah. Hannah really wanted to have children, but was unable to. One day, she was so sad about this that she burst out crying and praying to God to give her a son. One of the priests of Israel named Eli was nearby and heard her and assumed she was drunk. "How long are you going to stay drunk?" he said to her. "Put down your wine." Hannah explained that she was not drunk, but weeping and praying for God to give her a son. When he heard this, he prayed that she would indeed have a son. Soon after, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel. When he was a young boy, she brought him back to Eli, the priest, and the two of them prayed that God would use Samuel. One night, when Samuel was a little older, God spoke to him in his room, telling him about things that would happen in Israel in the future, called prophecies. This was the beginning of a special relationship between God and Samuel. God would use Samuel to speak to the Israelites over and over as a prophet. But the Israelites weren't satisfied with the prophet. They wanted a king, a military ruler, like the other nations around them had. Despite Samuel's warning against it, they demanded God give them a king. Eventually, God told Samuel who to make king, a man named Saul, who was easily a foot taller than any other man, someone the Israelites would trust to lead them. Samuel brought Saul in front of all of Israel. When the Israelites saw him, they shouted, "Long live the king!" Hearing that Israel had a new king, the Philistines gathered a huge army, so large that some of the Israelites ran away in fear. But Samuel gave instructions to Saul that would lead to their victory. He told Saul to wait in a region called Gilgal until he could meet him there. Then they would give a sacrifice to God before the battle with the Philistines. But Saul grew impatient, and before Samuel got there, he offered the sacrifice himself. Saul's actions had terrible consequences. He continued to choose to go against what God commanded, and instead build up his own wealth and power, leading to the end of his rule in Israel. It was time for another king.
Pray. Holy God, we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. We begin chapter 10 with a scene going like this. The children of Israel have come through a challenging time in the period of the judges, and now we've come into a more hopeful time. God continues to give the people second chances about life. A new beginning is about to happen, and they will try to put the old ways of their sinful and disobedient past behind them. And God calls a priest to lead them. Today we hear the story of the priest Samuel being called to serve God, and the anointing of Saul as the king of Israel. In this chapter entitled Standing Tall and Falling Hard, it is about two leaders with very different stories and very different consequences. Being a leader, you can stand tall or you can fall really hard. I must say, I was having a hard time pondering about what to speak about today when we're talking about leaders falling hard without thinking about Rob Ford. Talk about a man who's fallen hard. We need in this world great leaders. In the headlines, there is lots of news about poor leaders getting our attention. We see the results of poor leadership when people lose their jobs or their life savings. Meanwhile, the leaders themselves walk away as millionaires. But there are great leaders in the world. But it's unfortunate that we don't always hear about them or read about them in the headlines in the same proportions as poor leaders. Leaders influence people, good and bad. In chapter 10 of the story in 1 Samuel 3, the first leader we find is Samuel, who was called by God as an 8-year-old boy from his sleep as he was in the temple with Eli. Fast asleep, he hears this call, "Samuel, Samuel," and he wakes up. He responds and he goes running off to Eli. And Eli says, "I didn't call you, go back to bed." And then it happens again, "Samuel, Samuel." And he wakes up and he goes to Eli, "Eli, you've called me." "I didn't say a word, it's not me." And then again it happens a third time, "Samuel, Samuel." And he goes back to Eli. And at this point Eli realizes that it actually is not his calling, but rather God is calling Samuel to be a priest at age 8. The Lord called Samuel to be a leader of the people of Israel at age 8 at that point, and he would grow up to be a great leader in the temple, and ultimately be a priest governing and looking after the people of Israel. The second leader in chapter 10 of today is King Saul, who was chosen to be a king of Israel. He at first was reluctant and uncertain about leadership and influence, but then he accepted that call. And he made influence wherever he led. From the story we learn that he was not always the leader that God wanted him to be. He encountered failure after failure as he forgot and neglected the ways of God in his life. He forgot about the way that Samuel had told him of how to be obedient toward God. The time of Samuel's priesthood, the people of Israel faced battles against the Philistines as they sought to recover the Ark of the Covenant, which was taken from them in the battlefield. And after a long while, Samuel was getting old, and the people of Israel began to grumble and complain. Have we not heard that story before? The people of Israel grumble and complain about something. They seek out a new leader and they say, "Look at those other nations. They've got a king over them. How come we don't have a king? We want our own king like them." They want to be like other cultures with their own king to rule them. Of course, Samuel hears this call and this plea, and he doesn't like what he hears. And yet, he bows down in humble service to the people of Israel that he is priest over, and he bows to their demands, and he seeks out Saul. And Saul is called by God to be the king of Israel. And at age 30, Samuel anoints Saul as king with oil. Samuel gave the people of Israel exactly what they wanted, even though that Samuel knew better, because that really wasn't what God had in mind in the upper story. In chapter 13, or page 141 of the story, we see the challenges that Saul faced. In a way, he was actually set up for failure, and the people of Israel chose to turn their backs against God and took matters into their own hands by asking Samuel to select a human king. The first conflict that Saul faced was successful. A neighboring nation threatened to gouge out the right eye of every Israelite as a way to disgrace them. Ooh, it ain't pretty. Not at all. But the battle was successful, and all of the Israelites left with both eyes intact. And Saul felt pretty good that his first battle he won, and the people rejoiced, and they were glad. This bolstered Saul's confidence as a leader, but I think it went to his head, because then after that, soon, failure after failure in the battlefield, he didn't win. And he turned away from God's holy ways. Saul's leadership as king failed because he went back to the old ways of the leaders of the past for the children of Israel. Familiar story, isn't it? In the face of conflicts, when leadership emerges, Challenging situations cause leaders to either stand tall and emerge as a victorious and great and strong leader who's noble, or it causes them to fall hard. In conflict, leadership isn't developed, it is revealed by their actions and the way that they present themselves. This story reveals a lot about Saul, who is the leader of the people of Israel, as he attacks the Philistine outpost. But I want to talk about today some of the poor leadership traits of Saul, and then I'm going to talk about some of the good leadership traits of Samuel. The first poor leadership trait of Saul that we see is insecurity. There are times that people are cast in leadership roles who don't have the confidence. But as an insecure leader, they never go and they ask for help. They take it on themselves because they don't want others to see their weakness. They want to consume everything in themselves and be responsible, even though they may not know how. Insecure people lack vision and authority, and they don't empower others because they're so fixated on their own needs, their own self-worth. The second character trait that is not the best for Saul is, of course, selfishness. Saul was a poor leader because of his own selfishness. Poor leaders worry about what's best for themselves. Selfish leaders take credit away from others. A true leader allows others to excel in their own giftedness and not try to do it themselves. Ultimately, a good leader is about empowering others to go and to lead and to shine. Live out the way that God has called them to be in the world. And the wishes of God don't matter to those people because they're caring more about themselves. And it leads us into the third character trait that's not the best for Saul, is that of impatience. Saul made rash decisions as he led the people into battle. He didn't think carefully about what is best and what the consequences might be as he led thousands of the Israelite army into battle and people lost their lives. Saul was fixated on doing rather than being. Impatient leaders want to get the job done at all costs, no matter who or what might get hurt along the way. They go their own way and neglect the needs of others. God is more concerned with who we are than what we do. Saul was so fixated on what he did for the people that he didn't have time for God to develop him as a good, strong, and noble leader. And then we move into Samuel. Samuel, being called as a priest in the temple at age 8, grew up in the way of God. And he followed and was obedient to God's commands for him. The first one of the character traits of Saul that's of a positive nature is boldness. Leaders know how to be bold when needed, taking a stand for what they believe in from a place of conviction rather than a place of their opinion. They stand up for what is right. They show leadership at a time of strife and trouble and conflict. They stand up to their oppressors. The second leadership quality of Samuel is integrity. He never compromised when he wanted to do things. A leader's credibility depends on two qualities. First, what they have done and who they are. A leader is known by their competencies and who they are. When a leader has a certain character, but they operate from a different place, they don't have integrity. They lack that. Good leaders know how to influence people when they have integrity in what they do. We are all leaders in our own right. We're all called by God by name to be a leader in some way. Whether that is a leader of our family, to be a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. We're called to be leaders. Or maybe we're called to be a leader in the workplace or maybe in the church. Leadership comes through that call that God has for us. The third character trait of a positive nature of Samuel is humility. He was a humble leader, caring about others more than themselves. Leadership's not about us or the position that we hold. It's about the other people that we serve. It's putting the needs of others before our very own. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4 says, "Do nothing out of selfish admonition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking for your own interests, but each of you for the interests of others." Samuel was a leader because he didn't care what he got out of it in his own life. He cared about what others got out of it. He cared more about the people of Israel. He honored the children of Israel and their desire for an earthly king, even though he knew it was not the best for them. Leaders change lives, and Samuel wanted to change the lives for the better. And each of us are called to be leaders. Each of us are called to change lives in our homes, our work, our school, our church, or our community. We have the choice of what kind of leader to be. We can be a leader like Samuel, who's called to serve and be dutiful to God and placing the needs of others before us in humility. Or we can be a leader like Saul, who thought of himself as most important and neglected the needs of those around him. I remember as a young boy, I played on a baseball team. Never won any tournaments or anything like that. But I had two coaches that were coaching for our team. One by the name of John, and John was a man who I think went to school to be a jail guard. He was heavy in the discipline and cold in the personality, and he threatened the kids with violence if we didn't hit the ball right or catch it. We wondered how bad it would be if he ever crossed. No matter what happened, this guy was always putting us down. Never a happy person. The second coach we had on that baseball team's name was Tony. And Tony was always happy, no matter how bad the loss would have been. And I think we lost every game in the season. But he was a cheerful leader. And he smiled and he said we'd get a good job, even though there's no way we came close to hitting the ball. After a strikeout, we did a good job. Huh? We all knew we failed. And John always told us, but not Tony. Tony always gave us a one-up and said, "Good job, better next time." Tony was a tough person. Tony was a person of authority and integrity, incredible positivism. And for him, there was always a silver lining in what we did. With Coach John, we learned how to be a better ball player with the right skills and techniques. But with Coach Tony, we learned how to be a better person beyond the diamond. The thing about Tony is that he walked with the Lord. He went to a local church. I can't remember what denomination now. But he played his life out of a place of faith and understanding in the ways of God. And he radiated the light of Christ's love for others to see. Tony saw greater value in the teamwork of building each other up and less about skill development, as John did. Tony taught us to be a better people, a better person. He taught us how to give our best, but also to honor God in the process. Coach Tony influenced my life for the better. If we look back in our lives, who have been the influencers? Who have been the leaders that we remember? They could be good or they could be bad, but they've made an influence and an impact in our life. To close, there are individuals who have influenced us because of what God did in them. It is in this understanding that we need to know that each of us are called to be leaders in some way. You may not be called to be a minister. You may be called to be a teacher. You may be called to simply be a parent or a small group leader or a good citizen on your block caring for someone else's pets or their children or whatever. Dr. John Maxwell, a Christian author, says everything in the church rises and falls on leadership. Leaders influence others. Without leaders, no one will know which way to go. Leaders cast vision. They cast the direction of where it's supposed to be in the most positive light. Leaders have choices of how they wish to be in life and how they will lead others around them. Do you want to lead like Saul, the king, or like Samuel, the priest, or like Coach John, the dictator, or like Coach Tony, the appreciator? Are you going to be like Samuel, who left a legacy of changed lives for the better, or like Saul, who marked it with a mess and many casualties? Or like Coach John, who belittled the players for his purposes of winning games, or like Coach Tony, who lifted up in prayer those who followed his lead? God is the best leader for our lives. God influences us in the best, most possible ways. As we go out of this place, think about the kind of leaders that have influenced you, and think about the kind of leader that you want to be. And is Christ part of that decision? Is God first and foremost in your life? Do you follow the ways of Christ with justice and compassion and with love in all that you do? We are the hands and the feet of Christ in the world. And we hear God's call to go out and make a difference in our world, in our little corner, in our family, or in our church. We share the love of God in all that we do. Let us all be an example of God's love here on earth. Let us be like Samuel, who was called by God. Thanks be to God. Amen.